We look at topic 2, the ecosystem, and specifically section 2.1, the structure of ecosystems. Listed here are all of the objectives that we consider in this lesson, but our focus will be primarily on explaining the principles of the pyramids of numbers, biomass, and productivity, and then also on describing and explaining population interactions using examples of named species. What you'll find is that in focusing on these two primary objectives, the less significant ones listed here will also be covered as a result. So let's move ahead to our first slide here, and we see a snail sitting in the middle of its habitat, the area in which it lives, and the snail carries out certain functions and has a role in that habitat. It has a specific area that it would function within, and that is describing its niche. Each organism belongs to a certain species, and members of the same species are expected to be able to produce offspring with other members of that species, and in turn those offspring must be able to reproduce themselves, which is what we call viable offspring. So that would take care of the definition of a species. Of course, members of the species have to be living in similar kinds of habitats as well. Organisms that together, of different species that together inhabit a given habitat, we call that a community, and all of the members of a particular species forms a population. Within this physical environment, the living things interact with non-living components, and that together formulates or forms the ecosystem. And within the ecosystem, of course, you've got lots of non-living components or abiotic factors that impact the living components. For instance, our snail right here is affected by temperature, by sunlight, by the amount of moisture. Our snail is affected by other snails, by things that might want to prey upon it, predators, by things that might want to infect it, like parasites or diseases or competition with other organisms that are feeding on similar things and doing similar things in the habitat. So there are a whole list of terms that we need to get familiar with in this section, and they are all listed here for you. The community, the ecosystem, the population, the niche, the habitat, and the species. These particular definitions are taken from the glossary in the IB ESS Subject Guide 2010. So moving along, let's consider some more abiotic factors. Here we see two turtles, and they are basking beneath a heat lamp and obtaining the necessary heat to keep their bodies warm. A non-living component, which is temperature, sunlight. Over on the other picture, we see moss in controlled containers, each with different amounts of moisture, and we see that there is a consequence. We see that there is an effect associated with the amount of moisture that you have in a particular container. The container with the most moisture having the best growth of moss. So there are lots of abiotic factors that affect organisms in their environment, but all of the organisms that live in a particular area form a community, and these organisms in the community typically have a feeding interaction, and one thing feeds on another, and the position that an organism occupies in this chain of feeding, or a food chain as it's called, is referred to as its trophic level. Let's look at this clip here from our aquarium, and we can see that the ghost shrimp, scientific name Paleomanates. Paleomanates, we can't specify exactly what species it belongs to, so we give just the name of the genus. We realize that it requires a certain kind of temperature and pH to live in. It feeds on detritus and algae and small invertebrates like Daphnia. You can see the Daphnia here, the little specks on the screen, small invertebrate. And our shrimp swims around feeding on various things, interacting with other shrimps, and moving to different parts of our container, our habitat, and in describing all the things that the shrimp does, the ghost shrimp, we are giving a definition basically of its role and the range that it occupies in the habitat, which really includes its niche. So the niche describes the section of the habitat that an organism would function in, and also specifies what it does or its role. And here we can see that the ghost shrimp Paleomanates is feeding at several different levels, and we will discuss this on the next slide. So let's move ahead now to a diagram of our aquarium here, and we will see that this organism here represents the ghost shrimp that we had in the previous clip. And the ghost shrimp, as we said in the previous clip, feeds on organisms that use sunlight to make food. Those organisms are called producers. So here we see that there's phytoplankton. They are the producers. The ghost shrimp feeds on that. The ghost shrimp feeds on plants, and it also feeds on the water flea, which is Daphnia. Those little specks that we saw, that's right here. So basically our ghost shrimp feeds on the things that make food, and it also feeds on things that feed on those things. So that would make it definitely feeding at two trophic levels. The fact that it also feeds on dead, decomposing, decaying matter, which is called detritus, puts it into another food chain as well, which is the decomposer food chain. But to keep things simple for the purpose of this slide, this organism here, it's definitely not a producer. It does not make any food, but it is a primary consumer because it feeds on things that do make food, making it a primary consumer, or something that belongs to the second trophic level, with producers belonging to the first trophic level. And the fact that it feeds on the herbivorous water fleas, that would also make it a secondary consumer. So it's clear from this that organisms within a community can feed at several different trophic levels at the same time. And here is an example with our ghost shrimp, Paleomanates. So the food chain takes a section of an ecosystem and looks at feeding relationships among a group of organisms within that community. Right here in this diagram, we see that phytoplankton, which is basically algae. A common example of a microscopic algae is chlorella, would be eaten by our small water fleas, which are Daphnia, which we have several species of Daphnia or water flea, and then Daphnia in turn is eaten by Paleomanates, our ghost shrimp. So therefore, when you describe the relationships in a linear form like this, with one thing feeding on the next, of course our ghost shrimp can feed on several other things, but when you just take this linear direction of one thing feeding on another, then you have got a simple food chain. And a more complicated look at the feeding relationships in a community would give rise to a food web. And within our typical pond ecosystem, we have feeding relationships that may look like this. It, of course, could be a bit more complicated than this, but all the same, this in front of us here is an example of a food web. Down at the bottom, we have producers, Lemna, the duckweed, and microscopic algae. The two producers are identified in this food web. Of course, as you can see behind, in the picture behind, there are other producers like this big plant in here. But with just these two, we see that there are several primary consumers, and you've got Daphnia, the pond snail, Limnia, and Pulmonates, the ghost shrimp. And then we've got things feeding at the secondary level as well. We can see that Pulmonates is also a secondary consumer in the sense that it feeds on Daphnia, which also feeds on microscopic algae. So the term trophic level really says where you would find something in the feeding system that you have. Producers being the first trophic level, primary consumers being the second trophic level, and secondary consumers being the third trophic level. And of course, if you expanded things and you had something that fed on notonecta, the back swimmer, then that would be a tertiary consumer. And if you went even further to have something feeding on the tertiary consumer, that would be called a quaternary consumer. So the food web is a more all-inclusive diagram or model to show the feeding relationships within a community, whereas food chains can be pulled out of food webs, and they just show this linear flow from one producer through to one primary consumer, through to a secondary consumer, and so on. So moving ahead now, we can take our trophic levels, our various feeding levels, like our duckweed here, lemna, and quantify how many of them you have. And if we had a very simple system, like the one in this diagram, with 10,000 duckweed per square meter of a pond, supporting 3 goldfish that feed solely on the duckweed, then we can put together a simple diagram like this, which we would call a pyramid of numbers. This really just showing the number of individual organisms within a population at each trophic level. So here at the first trophic level, simplifying things, we just count that there are 10,000 duckweed in a pond or in a square meter of a pond, and then feeding, being supported by that 10,000 duckweed, are 3 goldfish. Of course, this diagram could get a lot more complicated, especially if you include at this level all of the producers. Then you'd have to count all of the individuals of every species of producer, and then at the second level you would have to count all of the individuals of each species of primary consumer. The pyramid could also get complicated if you have organisms feeding at different levels. So to keep it simple, we might just take a given food chain and then use that given food chain to create a simple pyramid of numbers, which shows the number of organisms of a particular species that you find at a particular trophic level, and you quantify how many of those you have, and then you go ahead quantifying the number that you have at each subsequent trophic level. So here the diagram's been simplified for us because we just model a very simple system with just 2 species existing, one feeding on the next, the duckweed lemna and our goldfish. So this pyramid could get out of pyramid shape sometimes. And if you look at this diagram right here, you will have an idea as to how the pyramid could become inverted, as they say. And things kind of speak for themselves right here in this diagram. One large tree could be the home of thousands or hundreds of insects, and then feeding on those hundreds of insects could be just a couple of predators, like you see in the picture here. And then that would mean that if the pyramid of numbers has to reflect the number of individual organisms, that it would be kind of skewed or out of pyramid shape, which is what we refer to as an inverted pyramid of numbers, meaning to say that we have just a one tree at the bottom, maybe like 300 insects or grasshoppers, and then just the 2 organisms feeding at the secondary level, just to show you that the pyramid of numbers isn't always going to have your typical pyramid shape. And then we can have another kind of pyramid, one where we get the biomass of our organisms. So suppose we were to take our goldfish out of here and find their biomass, assuming that a couple of the fish died naturally, we could take them and put them into a drying oven here and let them dry out, and then find the dry biomass of one fish, and then we can use that to estimate how many fish. Well, based on how many fish you have, you can estimate the dry biomass of the particular trophic level. A similar thing could be done for duckweed, and then we would have a measure of the biomass in units of grams per square meter. So you can see some steps right here in actually going about finding the dry biomass. First of all, you can find the wet biomass if you like of the particular fish, but you have to place it in an oven for about 24 hours at about 75-80 degrees Celsius. You don't want to burn the organism, you just want to get the water out. And then you ensure that the mass is constant, and then you find the mass of your sample and the mass of an empty beaker, and by the difference method you would be able to find the dry biomass of your sample. With that dry biomass in hand, you can then use it to estimate how many the 3 goldfish would weigh, or how many your 10,000 duckweed, or what would be the mass of your 10,000 duckweed. And then you can express everything in the units of grams per square meter. So depending on the size of the area, you can then work out the amount of biomass that you have sitting at any given point in time when you took your sample. So it's what you would call a snapshot of the amount of mass that you have at each trophic level per unit of area. And you can see here that our pyramid here would look very much like this if we converted it into a pyramid of biomass. The unit of energy could also be used, because from mass we can generate energy, so therefore a certain amount of grams of biomass could be holding within it a certain amount of joules of energy, so therefore the unit of the pyramid of biomass could also be joules per square meter. It is important to note that the pyramids of biomass and numbers, they represent storages. They are showing you that you might have 10,000 duckweed at a given point in time per square meter. They are showing you that those duckweed might have a mass of 104.5 grams per square meter at a given point in time. That is how much is stored in the ecosystem at that point in time. So it's a snapshot, it's a storage. If you're interested in reading some more about this very technical topic, you can go to this URL down here and get some more information. So moving ahead to the possibility of the pyramid of biomass being inverted. And again, we stress that the pyramid is a snapshot of the storages at a given point in time. Let's consider a more complicated type system, sort of like the one we looked at earlier on the video clip, where you have a lot of phytoplankton, like the algae, the microscopic algae, being fed upon by zooplankton like Daphnia, the water flea, and some small fish feeding on Daphnia or some shrimp, and some larger fish feeding on the small fish or the shrimp. And what you would find is that if you were to take all of the algae out at a given point in time, on a given day, you took a sample out of all the algae, you put them on a scale, you found their biomass, you did the same for each subsequent trophic level, it could very well be that the biomass in grams per square meter ends up giving you a picture that looks like this right here. And what it means is that you have a smaller mass supporting a bigger mass, but we have to be aware of the fact that this is a storage. It's just a frozen picture in time. And the reason that this can actually exist is because the rate at which the phytoplankton regenerates itself is sufficiently fast to support the zooplankton. So it's important to note that the pyramids of biomass and numbers represent storages of matter and energy. And there's one pyramid that's always going to be in the form of a pyramid because it does not represent temporary storage, but it represents a flow over time. And the key difference between the pyramid of productivity, as it's called, and the pyramid of biomass is that the pyramid of productivity includes the unit year or some unit of time. So that gives it the measure of flow over a period of time. And with that in mind, and in keeping with the second law of thermodynamics, the first trophic level is always going to have a huge flow of energy, a lot more than the second trophic level and even a lot more than the third trophic level, because it's no longer a frozen picture of a stock, but it's a long-term picture of the flow of energy through that particular level over a period of time. And with that under consideration, we can say that roughly 10% of the energy is just transferred from the first level to the second and then to the third. So it's like a rule of thumb where only 10% of the energy is passed to the next trophic level, and energy is consumed in respiration and lost as heat. The units suggest that the pyramid of productivity shows a flow, and it's all about a rate, whereas the pyramids of biomass and numbers show a temporary stock or a standing crop. So this scattering of energy, this loss, is in keeping with the second law of thermodynamics, or the law of entropy. So with the 10% rule, as it's called, in mind, I would like you to take this diagram here and to complete your pyramid of energy. Again, you see the energy that's fixed or put into the plant's structure in photosynthesis is 874,900 kilojoules per meter squared per year. With the 10% rule in mind, I would like you to complete 2 more levels so that you get a pyramid of energy. And your diagram should look something like this. And if you've actually quantified the numbers, you would get 10% of this being up here and 10% up here. And if you actually took the time to measure with a ruler, then you would realize that if the diagram has to be according to scale, this would be 10% the size. This box here would be 10% the size of this, and this in turn would be 10% the size of this. So therefore, this being a flow of energy, you have to obey the second law of thermodynamics. It's not a storage of energy at any given point in time, but it's a flow over a period of time, which means that the pyramid of energy will always be in the form of a true pyramid. And with these losses over time, this pyramid structure of having most energy at the bottom level, less at the first level, and even less at the third level, it leads to certain bigger issues. And these issues, we can say, are consequences of the pyramid structure. Let's consider a persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic chemical. And there are lots of them out there. Mercury is one. DDT, which is which was used as something to fight malaria, as a pesticide. And there are lots of other chemicals that belong to groups called the dioxins and the polychlorinated biphenyls that are used in various industrial applications. These chemicals, when we manufacture them and they get out into the environment, they are not degraded or broken down within a short space of time, or sometimes even over a long period of time. They're not broken down, so they are persistent, and of course they are poisonous, toxic. But let's consider what we mean by the term bioaccumulative. So let's look at our diagram here, which helps us out in understanding the process. These represent our PBT, such as mercury or DDT. These chemicals get into the tissues of small fish, and most of them are soluble in fats or lipids, and they stay in the body tissues of the fish. When they get in, the fish is not able to eliminate it. Sometimes if they're taken in with water, then the water is eliminated, but then the chemical is even concentrated within the body. So because these chemicals get into an organism's body and then they can't get rid of it, then they accumulate in the organism's body. And let's consider that 5 of these small fish, or a couple of them here in the diagram, take in some of these pollutants. And then one big fish comes and eats lots of the smaller fish. So when several of the small fish with small amounts of the PBT in its body tissue are consumed by larger fish, then because these pollutants don't get broken down, then the organisms that feed higher up on the food chain would end up having even more of the PBT in their body tissue. So this effect gets magnified as you go up the food chain. So this is why you would call this phenomenon biomagnification, and the act of accumulating the PBT in the body tissue is referred to as bioaccumulation. Sometimes in the aquatic environment, the pollutant is concentrated in the body tissue, and that would give rise to another term, bioconcentration. But to simply understand that this effect is most significant at the things, for the organisms that feed at the highest trophic levels, is what we need to have in mind. This pyramid shape also has some other consequences. It limits the amount of energy that ends up going to the higher trophic levels, and it would, because of that, limit the amount of population that you can have of feeding at the tertiary and quaternary levels. For example, right here in this simple ecosystem, you would have a majority of small fish, even less larger fish, and then a fewer number of our birds coming to feed on the bigger fish. So therefore the amount of energy gets less, as we've seen, because there are losses in accordance with the law of entropy. The consequence of that pyramid shape is that a smaller population can be supported at higher trophic levels, and the higher you go, the amount that can be supported is even less. And then a third point is that if some change happens to any of the organisms that are lower down on this feeding hierarchy or this food chain, then the ones at the top are always vulnerable, because they depend on the ones lower down for food. So you would find that the small fish won't be impacted too much if something affects the organisms at the top. In fact, it would benefit their populations. But once there's a negative effect on any organisms lower down in this food chain, the ones at the top are always likely to be impacted. Another quick review question. All of the members of a species that live in a specific area, they comprise a population. Let's move ahead now to the issue of relationships and population interactions, and let's have a look at our picture here with 3 elephants in the foreground. There are some more, actually there's 6 of them or 7 of them here in the picture. But our elephants are being affected by a parasite, the tick, something we can't really see, but they have ticks on their bodies, and this tick living on the body of the elephant ideally would not want to kill the elephant, which is its host, but would want to suck off of its blood and get its nutrients in that way without taking the life of the elephant. Of course, this might have a negative impact on the elephant in that it would be losing blood, it might be weak, and if it's totally overrun by too many ticks, it could end up dying. But this kind of interaction where one organism, the parasite, the tick, gets benefit at the expense of another organism, the host, is referred to as parasitism. And within the same scenario, you could have organisms like this bird here landing on the elephant's body to feed on the very ticks, which would rid the elephant of something that's causing it harm, bring nutrients to the bird, and rid the elephant of the harmful tick. And if that kind of relationship exists, where both partners stand to benefit from the relationship, then we call that mutualism. So these are 2 simple kinds of interactions that happen within populations where organisms end up of different species have a close physical association with each other. In one case, it's a win-win situation like mutualism, and in the other case, it's one wins at the expense of the other, parasitism. A third category is sometimes recognized, called commensalism, but we do not need to discuss that. And let's move ahead to look at a classic example of mutualism. And this classic example is known as the lichen. And there are 3 types of lichens, and I would like you to find out a bit more about lichens and identify the 3 types that you see in this video. And I would also like you to find out why lichens are called indicators of pollution. So here in this video, We see on the trunk of this tree three kinds of lichens right here in this picture right now. I would like you to do some research for yourself, find out what they are, and then I would like you to tell me also why do we call lichens indicators of pollution? And you might want to go outside here in the city and here in Shanghai and see if you find any lichens, and then if you don't find any, you can probably guess why. Okay, so there are some other kinds of interactions, and from our video that we looked at on the Serengeti microworld, we might recall that we heard that there were 28 mammalian herbivores that live on the Serengeti plains, and do they all have the same niche because they are living in the same place, feeding basically at the same trophic level? They're all primary consumers. But what we would recall is that organisms like a giraffe, although they are herbivores, they are feeding at the tops of tall trees, specifically the acacias. The zebra and the wildebeest both feed on the grasses, but they feed on different types of grasses. There are other types of herbivores that feed on, after a giraffe, a zebra has eaten, they would be able to even mow the grass down a little bit lower. The elephant would feed on entire trees and small shrubs. So while you can have several organisms within the same trophic level, they would not necessarily occupy the same niche within that trophic level. And in that case, they are able to coexist. And the Serengeti, with its 28 herbivores, provides an excellent example of organisms existing within the same trophic level, but their level of competition between each other is very limited. So what we would call their interspecific competition is not as strong. And if you do have a very strong level of interspecific competition, for instance, another organism that behaves and feeds on and does exactly what a zebra does, then you would find that it's going to be either the zebra or that competitor that would become extinct over a period of time and be excluded as a result of the intense competition. And when this happens, we refer to that as competitive exclusion. So organisms do compete with other organisms at times, but basically each one has its own niche. One species competing with another one is referred to as interspecific competition. Of course, within a population, we have what we call the survival of the fittest, as all the members of the population struggle for the same exact resource, like one wildebeest competing with another one to escape the lions, or to find grass, or to find the water hole, or to cross the river with the alligators. And of course, this continuous struggle with members of your own species, then that is a type of competition that we would call intraspecific. Within a given population, there is intraspecific. Interspecific refers to a community of organisms, particularly to organisms that feed at the same trophic level. They would be competing primarily for a similar type of food resource and for similar type conditions. And when organisms are very close competitors and they belong to different species, then you would find that one species would be eliminated as a result of what we call competitive exclusion. And the same principle operates within a given species population, where we have only the strongest ones winning the struggle for existence and being able to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation. So 3 terms to be familiar with are interspecific competition, intraspecific competition, and competitive exclusion. The key issue in this relationships section is the one referred to as the predator and prey relationship. And of course, in a place like the Serengeti micro world that we considered, there is this predator-prey relationship between the wildebeest and the lion, or between the zebra and the lion. And we don't need to go very far to find a relationship between an organism and the thing that it feeds on. And if an organism feeds on grass, then we might use the term herbivory to describe that relationship. So a relationship that exists between the zebra and its grass, it's herbivory. Within our aquarium, though, we would be able to define the relationship between Daphnia and the microscopic algae, which are photosynthetic, as predator-prey. At least we would be able to see a typical cycle showing how the population of one thing is impacted by the other thing that it feeds on, and vice versa, which is what we try to show in this diagram down below here, showing you that if we had a simple closed system which had only Daphnia and green water, which is the algae population, then we would be able to show that under these conditions, these controlled conditions, the population of algae rises over time, reaches a certain level, and as the algae population grows, so does the population of Daphnia. After reaching its peak, or its carrying capacity, where resources are now being exhausted, the population of algae begins to fall, and with that fall, soon after that, you have a fall in the population of Daphnia. And as the algae population falls and then recovers, Daphnia also falls, but soon after also recovers and matches what happens with the algae. This kind of close correlation would be typical of a closed system where the Daphnia doesn't have anything else to feed on, and the algae are in a system where they're not affected by anything else besides the Daphnia and their environmental resources. And over time, you see that resources, the amount of algae resources regulates the population of Daphnia. So reaching a peak, and then you have the Daphnia population falling as a result of the fact that the algae population falls, and then increasing when the algae population increases. Ultimately, this is referred to as negative feedback, and you have what we call, in this part of the graph, a steady state equilibrium. Two terms that we discussed in our last section, and two terms that we should not forget. Steady state equilibrium is basically happening here. Limited fluctuations about a set point, and negative feedback where a system is going in one direction and then something happens and triggers it off to bring it back to equilibrium. Negative feedback and steady state equilibrium. There are some more classic examples, however, of the predator and prey relationship, and we don't have to limit ourselves to Daphnia and algae. And I would like you to go to the Habitable Planet and access a video here, which I do not have the rights to, so you can go ahead and watch it online, and you will find out a bit about the elk and the moose of Yellowstone Park when you look at it. Also, you can access videos of the moose and the wolves of Ile Royale, which is another classic example. Our textbook also cites the case of the lynx and the snowshoe hare. And with these three examples, I would like you to be able to tell me about any one of the above and write a short summary, if you need to, of the population fluctuations with this so-called predator-prey relationship. And I would like you to use the terms negative feedback and steady state in your description. And let's take a look ahead now to what we will be doing in class tomorrow. And it's to look at this model right here. And this model shows us 4 organisms in an aquatic ecosystem. Each organism occupies a different trophic level. And we've got a pyramid of numbers that we're going to generate from it. This particular pyramid of numbers is going to be a regular type pyramid, and that in itself is a hint as to the makeup of the community, the feeding relationships. And once we get the pyramid of numbers, then we will go on to measure the pyramid of biomass, which is grams per square meter. And then we will use the components of the model to find examples of predator and prey relationships, interspecific and intraspecific competition. Then we will reflect on some strengths and weaknesses of our model. And of course, we will want to spend some time to sharpen up for the IB exam with a few past exam questions on this topic. So I will see you when you come to class tomorrow.